Welcome back, adventurer. Tonight the lamps do not so much glow as endure. The flame on the nearest one leans every now and again, as if it has heard something moving in the walls and has chosen, wisely, not to investigate. Above us, Waterdeep continues its usual performance. Coin pretending to be meaning, noise pretending to be life, pedigree pretending to be merit. Somewhere a tavern is inventing a hero out of drink. Somewhere a magistrate is selling delay as procedure. Somewhere a noble child is being taught that inheritance is the same thing as worth. Down here, beneath old stone, under the weight of cellars and forgotten stairs and the city's more respectable lies, we keep better company. Shelves, dust, wax, the soft and stubborn pressure of memory, refusing burial. You have returned to the secret stacks. Welcome again to The Lich's Tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. I am Aurelian Cantonine, Baelnorn, Laura Warden, curator of Overripe Griefs, and one of the last living arguments against the idea that history improves when left unattended. I did not surrender mortality because I found unlife fashionable. I surrendered it because the living are terribly careless with memory. They smooth the sharp bits off their ancestors. They shorten wars into slogans. They misplace causes and preserve only victories. I remain because someone must keep the shelves from being reorganized by the comfortable. Last lesson, my eager apprentice, we stood at the hinge of an older world. We spoke of dragons and giants, of Astoria and the Ordning, of rune memory, draconic myth, the 1,000-Year War, the Vonindod, Hjörnir Wormreaver, Octrian of Dawnfire, Winterflower Duskmere, and the Dracorage mythal that taught dragonkind the sky itself could be turned against them. We watched the great powers of the Dawn Age prove too proud to coexist and too durable to vanish cleanly. We watched a world loosen under their exhaustion. And in that loosening, in the spaces between scaled dominion and broken giant order, we saw the next claimants to history beginning to gather themselves. Tonight, at last, we step into the first flowering. Not the simplified version, not the painted glass version where the elves emerge fully formed in moonlight, draped in wisdom, trailing flawless choirs and ethically sourced starlight. No, we step into the real thing. The first flowering is one of the most beautiful ages in Faerûnian memory. It is also one of the most dangerous, because what the elves build in these millennia is not just a collection of kingdoms. It is a network of civilizations. That difference matters more than most people realize. A kingdom can fail and leave ruins. A network can fail and leave trauma in every surviving node. Tonight we will speak of the early Elven realms not as isolated courts scattered prettily across the map, but as connected, speaking, trading, intermarrying, ritual-sharing powers whose brilliance made them stronger and whose connectedness made their eventual fracture catastrophic. We will speak of high magic, not as big elf spells, which is the sort of phrase used by people who deserve to be pelted with index tablets, but as the great art of the people, communal, sacrificial, civilizational, the magic by which elves stop merely casting and begin arranging reality around shared intent. We will speak of mythals. Ah, yes, mythals. Not as mechanical curiosities, not as adventure hooks waiting in old city ruins, but as social engines, geopolitical statements, environmental constitutions, and proofs of cultural confidence. We will speak of what they do to daily life, to class, to diplomacy, to trade, to migration, to fear, to the way a city thinks about itself when the air has been taught to take sides. We will speak of Tintagear, of Prince Durathil, of Sharlario Moonflower, of Bonaluri's sacrifice, of the first sundering and the making of Evermeet, one of the most radiant confessions of civilizational anxiety ever performed in high magic. And then, because beauty in Faerûn is rarely permitted to remain innocent, we will speak of the early tensions already gathering beneath the flowers. Arivandar, Mieritar, Ilithir, custodianship, brilliance, and hard power. The fuse being lit while everyone still insists the music is lovely. Because if you wish to understand why elves still mourn these ages, you must understand what was actually lost. Not merely cities, possibility. Not merely kin, confidence. Not merely beauty. The belief that beauty and power could remain married without one eventually poisoning the other. But before we step into that green and dangerous radiance, a brief word from tonight's generous sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions, masters of crafting robust web applications and solving the thornier inconveniences of the modern internet. Whether you need an elegant front end, a stable back end, or a seamless joining of the two that does not collapse the first time real users behave like users, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. They build systems with more structural honesty than most ancient dynasties. Now, lay your hand on the table for a moment. Feel the grain. Good. We begin. The first flowering, broadly speaking, unfolds across the long stretch from roughly minus 24,000 to minus 12,000 daily reckoning. Those dates, like all ancient dates, should be held with care. Prehistory is a rude archivist. Songs survive where census rolls do not. Priest lists contradict maritime records. Dynastic genealogies lie with a confidence that would be admirable if it were not so irritating. Still, the shape is sound enough. In the aftermath of draconic weakening and giant contraction, the elves expand, settle, organize, enchant, and connect. This is the first point I need to impress upon you. The elves do not rise into an empty world. Never imagine that. The people who make that mistake always end up misunderstanding how hard-won the first flowering actually was. Faerûn, at the opening of the age, is still dangerous. Dragon dominions have not vanished. Giant remnants endure. Older ruins dot the landscape. The land itself remembers catastrophe in its rivers, coasts, mountain routes, and strange weather. The smaller races exist in varying distributions and levels of organization. Humans are present, though not yet culturally central. Dwarves are learning their own durable instincts. Goblinoids, orcs, and stranger things move in the seams left by fallen powers. The elves do not inherit peace, they inherit room. And room for a people of long memory, artistic ferocity, and magical ambition is enough. The opening centuries of the First Faerûn are not best imagined as conquest alone, though conquest certainly occurs. They are better understood as settlement through confidence. Elven migrations from Faerie into Faerûn do not happen once in a tidy line and then conclude like a clerk's report. They occur in waves, through gates, through ancient crossings, through old ways of the world that later ages would call fey roads, moon paths, or simply impossible. Different elven subraces arrive, settle, disperse, and sort themselves according to preference, climate, theology, risk tolerance, and the old mysterious mathematics by which peoples choose what sort of beauty they can bear daily. Some settle toward the western forests, some to the great green interiors, some to the coasts, some southward into harsher lands, some to places already spiritually resonant, where old groves and older silences suggest that the world is willing to be persuaded into elven form. That last phrase matters. Elves do not think of settlement the way humans often do. A human realm may ask, can this land feed us, defend us, enrich us? An elven realm asks those questions too, but usually adds others. Can this land sing in the right key with us? Can its forests sustain reverie and rite? Can water, moonlight, leaf and stone be persuaded into long companionship? Can this place become not merely inhabited, but taught? This is one of the deep reasons elven civilizations feel so different from later human ones. They are never merely pragmatic. Even their practicality seeks aesthetic and spiritual consonance. An elven city that is defensible but spiritually discordant is a compromise. An elven forest realm that is lovely but magically inert is unfinished. A coast that trades well but does not permit the right relationship between shrine, harbor, moon and music feels somehow incorrect. This is not foolishness, it is civilizational preference. And the most important thing that preference produces is interdependence. The elven world of the first flowering is not one empire. If you remember nothing else from tonight, remember that. It is not one empire. It is a network of civilizations. Arivandar in the north and northwest, Ilifan to the west, Keltormir in the interior greens, Chantel Othraya stretching broad and influential, Mieritar blooming in its dark and green brilliance, Ilithir hardening in the south, Orishar, Siorpir, Theanitar, Ayalur, and others besides forming local powers, buffer spaces, trade nodes, or future casualties. What makes them a network and not merely neighbors? Shared language, certainly, though not uniformly. Shared ancestry, yes, but ancestry alone produces as much resentment as affection. Shared devotion to the Seldarine, though again not in identical form. Shared migration memory from Faerie. Shared habits of reverie and long-term artistic production. Shared magical theory at high levels. Shared roads, paths, ports, embassy chains, familial marriages, craft exchange, priestly circulation, educational travel, and, most importantly, shared prestige. That last one is the most underestimated. Prestige is how networks become real. A realm whose poets are quoted elsewhere is networked. A realm whose high mages teach foreign students is networked. A realm whose rituals become influential beyond its borders is networked. A realm whose daughters and sons marry into distant courts is networked. A realm whose craftsmen set the standard for beauty in places they do not rule is networked. The first flowering builds exactly this kind of world. A young noble from Arivandar may study theory copied in Mieritar. An Ilifan diplomat may carry gifts made in Chantel Othraya to placate a Keltamiri court. A priestess of Sehanine in one realm may use chants refined in another. A caravan road may depend on local wards cast by one city but maintained by agreements between three. A marriage contract in the south may shift trade or ritual obligations in the north 2 centuries later. This is not only contact, it is mutual consequence. And here, apprentice, lies the brilliance and the danger. A network civilization can accumulate excellence rapidly because no one node must invent everything for itself. It can also accumulate grievance rapidly because no one insult stays local. That is the long shadow already beginning at the edge of the flowers. But before we approach the shadow, we must do justice to the light. What does the first flowering actually feel like? You know my answer already. It feels networked, not only politically, sensorially. Imagine traveling from one major elven realm to another in these ages. The roads may be forest paths, moonlit routes, hidden causeways, river corridors, coastwise passages, or ritual ways only partly visible to the uninitiated. But across those different terrains, you still encounter a recognizable civilizational grammar. Shrines to the Seldarine, similar guest rites, similar expectations of poetry, music, memory, and formal courtesy. Similar assumptions that magic belongs in the civic environment, not merely in the hands of exceptional individuals. Similar valuation of old lineages and old stories, even where the local interpretation of those lineages and stories diverges sharply. To move through the elven world is not to move through one kingdom. It is to move through variations on a shared aesthetic metaphysical civilization. The differences matter deeply. The relatedness matters more. Arivandar, for instance, does not merely differ from Mieritar by being elsewhere. It differs by offering a distinct answer to what elven excellence ought to preserve. Arivandar tends toward custodianship, hierarchy, formal refinement, pedigree, and the gold elf conviction that civilization decays unless very serious people defend it from dilution. That can produce real greatness, libraries, stability, courtly brilliance, continuity. It can also produce the sort of polite superiority that eventually mistakes itself for moral oxygen. Ilifan, by contrast, develops more flexibly. Coastal and western, more given to adaptation, diplomacy, and the practical advantages of surviving near exchange zones where elven contact with others cannot be treated as an occasional inconvenience. Ilifan learns things from being connected to margins. Margins teach realism. Keltormir turns inward in a different way. Green and moon elves, forest-rooted, less enamored of central civilizational display, more committed to preserving what they value, by not letting too much of it become spectacle. This is not apolitical innocence. It is another politics. One suspicious of excessive concentration, one more willing to say that not every beautiful thing needs a grand audience. Taleofthelich, that broad and mixed kingdom, matters greatly precisely because it does not fit later simplifications. Gold elves and moon elves, influence and negotiation, coast and interior, status and flexibility. Such a realm proves early that mixed elite arrangements are possible, though never effortless. Mierittar, our luminous Mierittar, brings together dark elves and green elves into one of the great experiments of the age, a realm of art, enchantment, cultural confidence and permeability. Not a utopia. Elven realms are never utopias, and anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to sell you an embroidered map. But a genuine civilizational proof that mixed traditions can produce greatness rather than decay. And Elithir in the south grows under harder stars. Older than many later northern narrators would prefer, ambitious, dark elf-led, expansionist, more openly comfortable with domination, slavery, and the practical use of force. A realm less interested in pretending appetite is not appetite. Do you hear it already? Not merely a list of polities, a conversation. What should an elven civilization be? What should it prioritize? Preservation or generation? Hierarchy or permeability? Order or experimentation? Coastal exchange or forest retreat? Ceremony or force? Beauty as proof of refinement, or beauty as the byproduct of power properly wielded? Every one of these realms answers differently. And because they remain networked, each answer remains visible to the others. That visibility is the beginning of the wound. But we are still in the flowering. We still owe the age its grandeur. To understand that grandeur, we must speak of high magic. Most peoples cast spells. That is not special. Special, in Faerûn, begins when a people learns how to make magic civic. The elves call ordinary spellcraft the art, and not without reason. In their hands, magic is very often aesthetic, cultivated, ritualized, social, and integrated with daily life far beyond what most human polities could sustain without collapsing from either envy or bookkeeping. But high magic is not merely more powerful spellcasting. It is something categorically different. It is the great art of the people. Communal, sacrificial, civilizational. When an elven wizard casts a spell, you are watching skill. When a circle of high mages performs a great working, you are watching a civilization attempt to state a preference so forcefully that reality agrees to wear it. This is why high magic resists comparison to later human epic magic or ordinary wizardry. The mechanical-minded always want to ask what it can do in abstract terms. The better question is what kind of social form makes it possible. High magic requires more than knowledge. It requires harmony. Not naive harmony, not everyone smiling because they have never disagreed. Something much harder, aligned intent among those participating and, at its greatest scales, enough wider civilizational coherence that the ritual reflects not merely a handful of mages, but the people gathered through them. That is what makes it so potent. and so dangerous. Because if your greatest magic depends on collective resonance, then your political problems become metaphysical problems immediately. Dissent is no longer only a debate, it is static in the current. Discord is not merely unpleasant, it is a risk to the very conditions under which your highest works can be sustained. This helps explain many things about Elven civilization, its love of ceremony, its obsession with memory, its tendency to aestheticize governance, its discomfort with open, ugly factionalism, its ability to create wonders that later ages cannot fully reproduce, and yes, its future temptation to confuse public harmony with moral truth. High magic is, in many ways, the spiritual technology of a people who believe civilization should not merely govern space, but tune it. Let us go deeper. What does high magic do? It can, at great cost, move land, sanctify forests, bind or alter weather, raise or protect realms, create or reinforce pathways, shape life around a collective desire, break powers too large to fight directly, preserve or redirect magical force, and, most famously for later ages, it can create mythals. But do not run too quickly to that word. Mythals are the best-known flowers of this tree, not the whole tree itself. First, understand the root. High magic is a communal ritual practice in which individual mastery is subordinated to collective effect. A high mage is not merely a stronger wizard. A high mage is someone trained to become part of an instrument larger than the self. This is why so many of the greatest workings cost dearly. Individual identity, vitality, longevity, or life itself may be spent. The spell is not cast and forgotten. It is lived through, sometimes died through. Bonaluri's sacrifice matters in Elven memory for precisely this reason. We will come to her fully in a little while, but hold the name now. Because high magic in the abstract sounds glorious. High magic in practice often asks someone to become part of the foundation stone. This is why the elves remember it with both pride and grief. Not because the great art is flawed, because it is honest about cost. And because its greatest practitioners are often required to give so much that later ages inherit the result without fully grasping the lives compressed inside it. Now let me say something that will clarify the entire age for you. The first great elven habit of the first flowering is binding magic not merely to events, but to places, peoples, climates, roads, harvests, and the quiet assumptions of daily life. That is the key. Most peoples, when they first acquire powerful magic, use it episodically. A battle, a healing, a storm broken, a gate opened, a curse cast. The elves look at magic and ask a more ambitious question. What if this were not an event, but an environment? That question gives birth to the age. It is why an elven road can feel safer without visible patrols. Why a grove may remain subtly fertile beyond what the soil should support. Why a harbor might become reliable in weather that should trouble it. Why a hall may preserve memory differently than stone alone permits. Why a city can seem to favor certain crafts, certain songs, certain states of mind, because it has been shaped not only architecturally, but magically around an idea of itself. This, more than any one tower or crown, is what makes the first flowering feel golden. Magic has ceased being occasional. It has become infrastructural. Now we may speak of mythals. Later ages, especially adventurers and their unreliable chroniclers, tend to think of a mythal as a fancy ward around an ancient city. This is not wholly false. It is simply embarrassingly incomplete. A mythal is not merely protection. A mythal is a civic environment. A mythal is what happens when high magic is taught to remain. It is a place-bound magical field, yes, often layered, subtle, persistent, and incomprehensibly intricate by the standards of later magical engineering. But if you describe it only that way, you have described the skeleton and ignored the life. What does a mythal do in-world? It teaches a place to behave. That sounds mystical, and it is, but let us make it practical. A mythid city may limit hostile magic. It may make certain forms of entry harder or impossible. It may protect walls, roads, or waterways more efficiently than visible troops alone. It may purify air or water. It may preserve structures from natural decay. It may favor healing. It may blunt fire. It may strengthen agriculture within a region. It may guide or conceal pathways. It may permit sworn defenders privileges that outsiders do not possess. It may suppress vermin, disease, or hostile spirits. It may support portals, moon bridges, communications, light, public safety, and ritual continuity. It may make scholarship easier, craftsmanship steadier, life longer, travel safer, and urban confidence more than mere sentiment. Now, pause with that. Because if those things are true, a mythal is not just defense. It is policy. A city with a powerful mythal is healthier, often richer, sometimes safer, certainly more prestigious, more attractive to migrants, more attractive to scholars, more attractive to artisans, more difficult to besiege, more capable of hosting archives, temples, academies, and dynasties because the very environment assists continuity. This means mythals have social consequences. They concentrate value. If one city can promise cleaner water, fewer magical catastrophes, safer trade, and greater scholarly opportunity because its civic magic has been woven into the place itself, ambitious people go there. Families relocate there. Students train there. Nobles marry into it. Pilgrims revere it. Merchants prefer its roads and docks. Allies want access to it. Enemies resent it. A mythal does not merely protect a city from danger. It changes the city's place in the wider political imagination. It says, here civilization has become confident enough to deputize the air. That is an extraordinary statement. Geopolitically, it is even more powerful. A realm whose core city or ritual heart is mythed can project a different kind of sovereignty. It needs fewer visible demonstrations of power because the city itself advertises that power continuously. Diplomats arriving under the influence of a mythal experience not just hospitality, but metaphysical competence. Rivals know that assaulting such a place is not merely a military problem, it is an ontological one. They are not only fighting guards and walls, they are fighting a landscape that has been persuaded to agree with its rulers. This affects diplomacy profoundly. A mythed capital becomes a prestige center. A realm with such centers is harder to dismiss as provincial or temporary. Marriage alliances with it grow more desirable. Students seek admission. Trade routes reorient around reliability. Refugees aim toward it because safety becomes contagious in the imagination. Vassal states or neighboring powers may accept subordinate relationships more readily if access to the mythed environment promises real benefit. And here is a darker truth. Mythals can also encode hierarchy. Not every place-bound great working treats everybody equally. Some privileges are reserved, subtly or directly, for sworn defenders, priests, royal blood, attuned mages, or members of the people as against outsiders. Some mythals can reinforce who belongs. Some can make foreignness more difficult to sustain comfortably. Some can serve as magical constitutions that say, without words, what sort of city this is and for whom. That means mythals are never neutral. The values of the realm become environmental. If a realm prizes beauty, the mythal may make beauty easier to preserve. If it prizes secrecy, hidden ways proliferate. If it prizes hierarchy, access and ease may not distribute evenly. If it prizes trade, harbors and passages may prosper. If it prizes scholarship, thought itself seems to settle more cleanly in the place. A mythal is the most elegant expression of the ancient political dream. What if the city itself believed in the regime? Now, because I promise to go deeper, let us imagine daily life under such a thing. A child raised within a mythed city grows up believing some forms of safety are normal, that lamps behave, that sick rooms heal faster, that public fountains do not easily sour, that certain alleys feel watched in a helpful way, that holy days resonate more strongly, that festivals draw light differently, that the old archive remains dry and unstained even through seasons when it should not, that strangers feel the city before understanding it. This creates a distinct civic psychology. Citizens of mythed places do not merely love their cities. They often feel chosen by them, and that is enormously important when we later speak of Elven mourning. Because when a mythed city falls, what is lost is not merely stone, population, and archives. It is a whole environment of belonging. People raised inside such places lose more than a homeland. They lose the background assumptions by which they understood civilized life. This is why elves mourn these ages so bitterly. Not because the cities were pretty, because the cities were total. They held law, beauty, memory, ritual, climate, prestige, and daily habit together in one coherent magical condition. Lose that, and you do not merely relocate. You become historically displaced. That is also why mythals matter militarily in ways that later readers often flatten. A mythed realm cannot be understood by troop counts alone. It may hold a pass with fewer soldiers because the place itself has been taught to assist defense. It may survive famine better because fields remain healthier. It may sustain morale better because public life remains more ordered under stress. It may project diplomatic confidence because visitors already feel the state's competence before hearing a single proclamation. A mythed city is, in geopolitical terms, a force multiplier in every direction at once: economic, cultural, military, spiritual, demographic, symbolic. When elves invest high magic into a place, they are not just defending it, they are declaring future intention. This is why the first flowering is incomprehensible without mythal thinking, even if not every early placework is labeled a mythal in the narrow later sense. The important truth is civilizational. Elves have learned to bind magic to urban and territorial identity. Later ages will remember the greatest instances more clearly, but the habit begins here, in these centuries. In the confidence that land can be taught, cities can be tuned, and civilization can outlast shock by enchanting its own conditions of life. And from this confidence comes one of the most consequential acts in Elven history: the making of Evermeet. But we must not hurry there yet. First, we need the emotional road. Tintagir. The old songs place a peculiar weight on the name, as they should. Even when the details blur, Tintagir survives in Elven memory as more than a city. It becomes one of those formative places that later ages use as emotional shorthand for what was once possible when confidence and beauty still believed one another. Tintagir stands in the old tales as an early seat of high elven aspiration, bound in memory to the line of Durothil and to the dream that the people might build not merely strong realms in Faerûn, but proper ones. Prince Durothil matters because he stands at the threshold between settlement and civilizational intention. He is one of those figures later memory refuses to leave merely administrative. That too tells us something. When a ruler remains beloved across catastrophes, it is rarely because he managed tariffs beautifully. It is because he becomes attached to a people's idea of itself. Durothil represents continuity with purpose. He is remembered not just as a prince, but as a bearer of the dream that Elven civilization could be both radiant and durable. Sharlario Moonflower matters in similar but differently textured ways. Where Durothil carries dynastic and political resonance, Sharlario carries the softer but no less important resonance of civilizational tenderness. The Moonflower line's association with grace, refinement, and the emotional continuity later elves desperately need when exile and rupture begin defining too much of their self-story. Names like Sharlario survive because they become moorings. In ages of fracture, moorings matter. And then there is Bonaluri. Ah, Bonaluri. High magic is never more itself than when it asks for a person. The later songs remember Bonaluri not because sacrifice is rare in Elven history, regrettably it is not, but because hers becomes emblematic. If you want to explain to a listener why high magic is not just powerful elf magic, you tell them about someone like Bonaluri, a working so great that knowledge alone is insufficient, skill alone insufficient, even unity insufficient. The spell requires a life bent wholly into it. This is why the first sundering and the making of Evermeet must be treated not just as magical feats, but as civilizational confessions. Let us speak plainly. Evermeet is not merely a refuge, it is an admission. The first sundering, by which the elves shaped, separated and consecrated what would become Evermeet, is one of the most breathtaking acts of high magic in the history of the people. And precisely because it is so breathtaking, later romantics make the mistake of narrating it as pure triumph. No, it is beautiful, and it is frightened. The making of Evermeet says several things at once. It says the elves can still perform world-scale greatness. It says they can bind memory, land, sea, and communal will into a homeland apart. It says they are strong enough to answer fear with architecture on the scale of myth. And it says, most painfully, that they no longer believe Faerûn alone can guarantee the future of Elven continuity. Do you feel the sadness inside the wonder? A people that creates a refuge isle by vast communal magic is not only showing off, it is preparing fallback memory. It is saying, if the mainland fails us, if the old world wounds us again, if dragons return, if younger races multiply beyond toleration, if our own divisions grow too sharp, then let there be somewhere the song still remembers itself. That is what Evermeet is at the beginning. Not just paradise, insurance. Insurance drawn in moonlight at catastrophic scale. And because the realms are cruelly elegant, the refuge becomes beautiful enough that later ages can forget it was first built in anxiety. Do not forget that. Evermeet is gorgeous. Evermeet is sacred. Evermeet is a masterpiece. Evermeet is also evidence that the elves understood very early that the first flowering contained the seeds of future rupture. This is why the first sundering belongs inside tonight's episode. Not because the event alone defines the age, but because it reveals the age's nervous system. Prince Durathil and Shalario Moonflower stand in the old retellings as names attached to this dream of preserved elven continuity. Bonaluri's sacrifice gives the dream its price. The whole working proves high magic can raise more than walls and wards. It can create civilizational memory in land form. And here, again, we return to the central insight of the age. The elves do not use magic merely to solve problems. They use it to create environments in which preferred futures become more possible. That is the deepest link between high magic, mythals, and Evermeet. All three are place thinking. All three are collective. All three are political, whether or not priests insist otherwise. All three teach a people what kind of life it has decided deserves protection. Now we must turn back from the sea and the sacred isle to the mainland, because it is there that the flowers become dangerous. By the middle and later first flowering, the great elven realms are no longer simply forming. They are interpreting themselves. This is another thing long-lived peoples do better and more dangerously than others. Once a realm has survived long enough to become successful, it begins to tell stories about why its success means more than luck. Arivandar prospers and says, clearly, disciplined custodianship and gold elf hierarchy preserve civilization best. Mieritar prospers and says, clearly, permeability, artistic abundance, and dark green synthesis are not weaknesses, but strengths. Ilithia prospers and says, clearly, softer realms mistake sentiment for governance and deserve to be outcompeted by those willing to use power honestly. Do not miss the word honestly. Hard realms always love that word. They mean by it, without embarrassment. These are not mere policy differences. They are ideological self-interpretations. And once a realm begins reading its own success as moral proof, its neighbor's different success becomes a challenge. Arivandar's early tension with Mieritar begins here, not with marching first, with contradiction. Arivandar can endure other realms being lesser. It struggles to endure another realm being admirable on terms not its own. That is what Mieritar becomes. A living contradiction. A mixed dark and green elf realm whose artistic and magical achievements demonstrate that Arivandar's preferred ladder is not the only route to greatness. This matters politically long before it matters militarily. A younger noble from Arivandar travels, studies, hears songs, reads treatises, sees Mieritari craft, watches Mieritari mages, admires Mieritari daring. He or she returns home carrying not only new taste, but comparative thought. That is dangerous, because comparison is the mother of civilizational insecurity. If the finest living work does not always come from the custodial center, then what exactly is the custodial center for? Arivandar begins answering that question with increasing sharpness. To preserve standards, to guard continuity, to supervise what brilliance alone cannot be trusted to govern responsibly. Do you hear the shift? Brilliance becomes insufficiency. Difference becomes instability. Plurality becomes a problem requiring guidance. This is the earliest heat in the fuse. And then there is Ilithir. Arivandar and Mieritar are often narrated as the main ideological pair in this age because their collision later dominates much of the Crown War's first phase. Fair enough, but Ilithir matters from the beginning because it changes what everyone thinks dark elf power might become. This is crucial. In the first flowering, there is not yet one singular dark elf political destiny. There are dark elves in Mieritar, dark elves in Ilithir, different theologies, different social habits, different state logics, different relations to art, conquest, hierarchy, and the wider elven network. Mieritar proves that dark elf-rich civilization can be radiant, high magical, artistically central, and not intrinsically cruel in its public philosophy. Ilithir proves that dark elf-led civilization can also become aggressively expansionist, enslaving, hard, and willing to turn superiority into policy without much need for perfume. This distinction should have disciplined later elven thought. Instead, under pressure, it becomes one of the first distinctions to rot. Not yet fully. Not in this episode. But the rot begins here, in the convenience of letting one realm's conduct spill suspicion onto a broader people. Ilithir's expansion, its slavery, its appetite for control, its research into difficult and often ugly forms of power, its cultural readiness to prize efficacy over the Northerner's aesthetic conscience, these things frighten other elven realms, and not without cause. Yet fear, when not carefully reasoned, is a lazy archivist. It prefers category to distinction, and that is how a realm like Meritar becomes increasingly burdened not only by what it is, but by what another dark elf power elsewhere is doing. This is one of the great griefs of the age, because it means the network that once shared brilliance begins to share suspicion faster than it shares honesty. Now let me take you, for a moment, into everyday life again. We have spoken of states. Let us speak of their citizens. A young Arivandaran noble is raised beneath standards, lineages, and the conviction that form preserves greatness. A young Miaritari artist is raised amid mixed influences, magical daring, and the assumption that beauty grows through encounter. A young Ilithiri aristocrat is raised under a sharper creed. The world yields to those willing to master it. Lesser peoples are utility, and hesitation is a privilege of the safer north. A child of Ilafan may learn that diplomacy is not weakness, but survival. A child of Keltormir may learn that not every argument deserves one's whole forest. A child of Chantel Othraer may learn the exhausting art of balance, which is simply another name for living between stronger opinions. All of these children grow up speaking enough of the same civilizational language to recognize one another, and enough of different ones to distrust the answers. That is a recipe. Not immediately for war. First for interpretation. Long before the Crown Wars, the Elven world becomes a field of mutually legible models. Which realm preserves the best ritual forms? Which hosts the greatest high magic circles? Which produces the finest art? Which keeps the old songs properly? Which protects the people best? Which has confused openness with dilution? Which has confused discipline with sterility? Which has confused strength with brutality? Which has confused beauty with permission? Those questions are everywhere in the late first flowering. Most are not asked openly. Civilized peoples rarely ask their most violent questions honestly until it is far too late. They ask them through sponsorship, through who is invited to perform where, through what schools are praised, through which students are funded, through marriage, through which roads remain safer, through how trade is directed, through which gift is chosen for which court, through who receives titles and who receives consideration. Because this is a networked civilization, every one of those subtle acts becomes politically resonant beyond its point of origin. Which brings us to a truth later ages remember only after losing it. The elves still mourn these ages because the beauty was real. Do not let later tragedy trick you into diminishing the earlier wonder. That is a moral laziness of its own. The first flowering deserves mourning, not because it was naive, but because it was genuinely extraordinary. A world where multiple elven realms could trade art, ritual, magical technique, and prestige across wide distances. A world where high magic still felt civilizationally generative rather than merely defensive or punitive. A world where a dark elf-rich realm like Mierittar could stand as a center of beauty and enchantment on the surface. A world where Evermeet was still new enough to feel like promise and not yet like retreat. A world where mythal thinking meant civic flourishing rather than later desperate preservation of what had not yet been burned. This is what later elves grieve. Not just the dead, the scale of what once seemed possible. They mourn these ages because they know the collapse was not inevitable in the trivial sense. It became likely through pride, fear, hierarchy, and long memory, yes, but there were real roads not taken, real kinships not yet broken, real places not yet cursed, real vocabularies not yet narrowed into race and exile. And that is why the mourning lasts. Because the beauty was not illusion, it was squandered. Now, I said earlier that the first flowering already contains the fuse. Let us light it more clearly. Arivandar's early tension with Mierittar is not, at first, open hatred. That comes later and in uglier forms. At the beginning, it is evaluative discomfort. Arivandar measures, Arivandar compares, Arivandar worries. Mierittar's brilliance begins to look, to certain Arivandaran minds, not merely admirable, but improperly situated. A realm too mixed, too artistic, too experimental, too willing to let prestige circulate outside custodial control. Here the Gold Elf tendency toward stewardship begins its dark turn. Stewardship, after all, is one misstep away from supervision. Supervision one step from claim. Claim one step from annexation. It will take House Vishan centuries to convert that ladder into a political machine properly. Episode 7, yes, I know, I hear you rustling already, will deal with that machinery in crueler detail. But the early ideological conditions belong here. Before the machine, there must be the frame. Arivandar already believes continuity and order ought to be protected. Mierittar already proves continuity and order can take forms Arivandar does not prefer. Elithir already proves some dark elf futures will frighten the rest of the elven world, enough to make lazy generalization tempting. There, that is the fuse. Not yet a war, a pattern of interpretive pressure. If you want the simplest possible version, it is this. Arivandar says, civilization must be preserved correctly. Mierittar replies, civilization can flourish differently. Elithir says, civilization belongs to the strong. You do not need prophecy to know those three propositions will eventually begin killing one another. Now let us pause a moment with the Seldarine, because I promised you political gravity, not just piety. The Elven realms do not share identical practice, but they do share gods enough that religion acts as connective tissue. Corellin's artistry and generative freedom, Sehanin's moonlit mystery and memory, Labelas Enoreth's time, Riliphane's deep arboreal sovereignty, Hanali's beauty, Erevan's disruptive freedom. These and others form a civilizational vocabulary across the network. This helps unite the realms. It also intensifies later fracture. Because when rivals appeal to the same gods, the question becomes not which pantheon is true, but which realm embodies it best. Arivandar can argue it preserves proper form. Mieritah can argue it honors flourishing and the artistic possibilities of the people. Ilithir increasingly begins pressing against what the mainstream Seldarine comfortably authorize, which is one reason darker cultic alternatives later find such purchase. A political program that grows too hard often finds the established gods morally inconvenient. That tension, too, belongs in this age. The first flowering is not only a time of building, it is a time in which the gods still seem close enough that realms wish to claim them, not in blasphemous terms, in representational ones. We, says each realm, show what the people were meant to become. That is a terrible competition to make immortal. Now let us return once more to Mythols, because I want to push the geopolitics all the way through. Imagine two rival cities. One has walls, troops, ports, and noble houses. The other has all of those, and a mature, place-bound magical field that regulates entry, stabilizes environment, favors healing, empowers defenders, supports scholarship, and advertises ancient magical competence continuously. These cities are not merely differently defended. They exist at different diplomatic temperatures. The Mythed City receives envoys under an ambient argument. We are old enough, united enough, and powerful enough to have taught our city to believe in itself. That affects bargaining. It affects alliance. It affects fear. And among elves, fear and admiration often sit at the same table. This is why mythals are not decorative in the history of the first flowering. They are geopolitical declarations. They say, we intend permanence. And permanence is the one claim every rival civilization most resents another making. Now imagine a whole network of realms increasingly capable of such acts, each reading its place-bound magics as evidence of civilizational worth. Does this reduce conflict? No. It gives conflict a higher register. Because now disputes are not just over land or trade. They are over which vision of elven life deserves to become environmental. That is a much harder thing to negotiate. If Arivandar believes its orderly model deserves greater centrality, and Mieritah's mythed brilliance continues proving another model viable, then politics gradually becomes existential. This is the pre-war weather, not blood yet, meaning. Now I must give you one more grief before we close. The making of Evermeet is sometimes treated by later elves as pure nostalgia object, lost perfection across the sea, refuge from the younger races, sacred inheritance. There is truth in this, but only partial truth. Evermeet at its creation is not just sanctuary. It is also the first great formalization of elven civilizational separation. A homeland apart, a place reserved, a place that says, however softly, perhaps the world of many peoples is not a place we wish to remain wholly answerable to. That instinct is understandable after dragons, after giants, after the old catastrophes. It is also dangerous, because every refuge teaches criteria of belonging. Every sanctuary raises the question of who counts enough to deserve the song. Evermeet, then, is both masterpiece and beginning of a harder inwardness. Not yet the full retreat, not yet the later losses, but a gesture in that direction. And if you wish to understand why later elves mourn these ages and mistrust themselves within them, here again is the answer. Their greatest works are almost never simple. Their beauty always carries policy. Their refuges carry exclusion. Their magic carries cost. Their openness carries vulnerability. Their order carries hierarchy. Their brilliance carries envy. This is what makes the first flowering so narratively irresistible and morally painful. It is the age in which the elves get almost everything they wanted: beauty, power, networks, magical permanence, sacred refuge, civilizational confidence. And in getting it, they begin preparing to ruin it. That is tragedy, properly understood, not bad luck. Success with an untreated flaw. Now, because the lesson must end where the next begins, let us bring the age to its edge. By the later centuries before -12,000, the elven world is radiant and tense. Arivandar continues hardening its custodial interpretation into increasingly evaluative politics. Mieritar continues flourishing too visibly to be comfortably absorbed into another realm's self-story. Ilithir continues demonstrating that southern dark elf power may become both effective and alarming enough to distort how the whole elven world talks about dark elves. Ilifan survives by practical wisdom. Keltermere holds to rooted autonomy. Chantel Othraya balances more than is fair. The smaller realms watch larger powers learn bad habits with immortal patience. High magic remains a glory and a danger. Mythals continue proving that civilization can teach places to behave. Evermeet gleams across the sea as both promise and confession. And the network, that most beautiful and fragile of elven achievements, continues passing art, memory, people, standards, and offense ever more efficiently between its nodes. This is why the next episode had to happen, because networks carry fire too. And once a civilization becomes interconnected enough, it can no longer wound only one part of itself. The wound travels. That is the setup for the Crown Wars. Not merely pride, interdependence with hierarchy. Not merely ambition, competing answers to the same inheritance. Not merely ancient grudges. A whole world elegant enough to share greatness and therefore elegant enough to share ruin. Now, before we end tonight's lesson, I will leave you with images worth keeping. First image, a road beneath moonlight between two elven realms, warded not flamboyantly but attentively, so that travelers feel safer without understanding why. A merchant caravan, a priestess, 3 musicians, and a young student on the way to study with a foreign master, all moving under one invisible civic promise. That is a networked civilization. Second image. A high magic circle gathering in silence before a working. No one speaks because the spell they are about to shape cannot be carried by knowledge alone. Each knows that if the working succeeds, later centuries may walk beneath its result and call it natural. That is the great art of the people. Third image. A city whose mythal does not only keep out enemies, but keeps fountains sweet, sickness rarer, archives drier, and the very mood of the place subtly aligned to what its founders believed civilized life ought to feel like. That is what a mythal does in-world. Fourth image. Prince Durathil and Sharlario Moonflower looking westward, not because the sea is lovely, though it is, but because beauty has become indistinguishable from strategy. That is Evermeet before it is nostalgia. Fifth image. Bonaluri stepping willingly into the cost of a working so vast that later generations inherit an island and remember only in fragments the person who became part of its possibility. That is why elves mourn. Sixth image. A hall in Arivandar, where a lord praises Mieritari artistry, and then, with the smallest shift in tone, asks whether brilliance that does not submit to proper order can truly be trusted. That is the fuse being lit. Seventh image. A Mieritari court where green and dark elves create something so beautiful that even the visiting northerners must admire it, and in admiring it, begin to fear what its success says about their own certainties. That is the first contradiction. Eighth image. A southern Ilithiri noble examining maps, chains, and reports with equal calm, already thinking in terms the north still prefers to dress in silk. That is the other end of the fuse. Keep those, they will matter. Now, next lesson, we step into the chamber before the blast. Before the crowns break, before the long courtesy gives up pretending. We will speak of immortal politics in uglier detail, of the Vishan as a political machine, of Arivandar's righteous appetite, of Mieritar's impossible position, of Ilithir as mirror and threat, and of the word Dairo before it becomes a destiny no people should ever have been forced to inherit. Because before the swords come, the language prepares them. Before the curse falls, the category is born. Before the war burns, the archive has already been arranged to justify the flame. But for tonight, let me leave you with questions. First question, what is more impressive to you? A civilization that can cast mighty spells, or one that can make magic part of the weather of ordinary life? Second question, which is the true center of a golden age? Its strongest kingdom, its holiest refuge, or the network of roads, marriages, shrines, ports, songs, and shared assumptions that allow many great places to exist at once? Third question, if a mythal can shape health, safety, law, prestige, and belonging, at what point does a magical defense become a constitution? Fourth question, why do you think elves mourn these ages so fiercely? Because the cities were beautiful? Because the kinships were real? Because the magic was greater? Or because they know in their longest and most private memory that they once built a world more plural and more radiant than the one they later allowed themselves to deserve? Sit with those. Do not hurry them. The best questions are like old forests. You do not improve them by running, And if you're listening through a sending stone or a scrying mirror or one of the modern contraptions by which old voices travel farther than old feet, then share your answers. Tell me which realm of the first flowering fascinates you most. Tell me what you think myths say about civilization. Tell me whether Evermeet strikes you more as triumph or confession. And tell me what you want illuminated next. Arivandar's ideology, Mieritar's magical culture, Ilethia's southern statecraft, the making of Evermeet, early high magic circles, or the first true crack in the Elven world before the crown wars begin. The shelves are deep, and I remain on speaking terms with most of them. Now the lesson ends. A final word before you climb back into the city above. This episode is brought to you again by Dharma Web Solutions, masters of crafting robust web applications and solving the thorny challenges of the modern internet. Whether you need an elegant front end, a scalable back end, or a seamless integration of the two, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. And yes, the larger archive continues to take shape. We are building a proper home for these lessons with Dharma Web Solutions, a place where transcripts, timelines, sources, realm notes, and all the other necessary scaffolding of serious remembrance can live in one ordered vault instead of scattering through the modern ether like frightened parchment. When it is ready, I will tell you. When it opens, you will have a door back into these ages. There will be merch as well, in time, hats and shirts, and other small mortal artifacts for those who wish to wear a little archival stubbornness in public. I will announce those when they have become cloth rather than intention. If tonight's lesson served you, leave a rating. It seems a tiny offering. Most offerings do at first, but in a world governed by algorithm and momentum rather than by proper librarians, tiny offerings are often how old candlelight continues to be seen. And one final note. If you compose ambient or cinematic music and would like your work considered as background for this Lorecast, we keep an open submission path. Send your track, your name, and your preferred credit to taleofthelich @gmail.com. If your music understands sea wind, moonlit roads, and the sound a civilization makes while still believing its beauty can save it, it may yet find a place beneath these words. Until next time, my apprentice, close the folio, cover the ink, leave the dust where it has earned the right to rest. And remember, a golden age is not defined by how brightly it shines. It is defined by how much of itself it dares to bind into the future. The tragedy begins when it assumes the binding cannot break. Good night. May your path be well lit, your quill always sharp, and your memory harder to kill than I am.